my name is Rosie Motene, and this is Mnet's School Ties podcast. Off the success of the Mnet docu-series School Ties, the channel wanted to expand the conversation so to amplify the awareness. And I'll be in conversation with child protection experts in the field. School Ties is a harrowing and groundbreaking 4-part documentary series that looks at grooming and sexual abuse of learners at some of South Africa's most prestigious and prominent boys' schools. The series unpacks the history behind what grooming and sexual abuse is, the aftermath, and what government, schools, and society at large are doing to stop the abuse in its tracks. As we know, almost all schools will have to grapple with sexual misconduct at some point, but the level of abuse that happens at these prominent schools and how it's well hidden is the reason why so many perpetrators go free for so many years, leaving behind an aftermath of hurt children. The series is produced by Idea Candy, who are known for Devil's Dorp and Steinhaste, and rather than sensationalizing the content, as it's very, very sensitive, they opted for in-depth interviews with child protection experts. And this is to give parents the opportunity to identify telltale signs of what grooming and sexual abuse is. The narrative also unpacks the history of these elite schools and why they've become a breeding ground for this type of behavior. In studio today, I have Luke Lumpert, who's Child Protection and Development Specialist, and I also have Dumisile Nala, who's the CEO of ChildLine South Africa. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Let's look at what grooming is. Luke, would you like to unpack what grooming entails and what it means?
So grooming is a very complex thing because if you think back to your history, for example, you'll talk about someone who assisted you to groom your talent. So we always see grooming as a way to sort of unlock talent and a way to get the best out of people. But when you get to sexual grooming, what happens is they use that process for the sexual gratification of the sex offender. So generally it starts with favoritism. So, I mean, I'd say to people who work with children, you know, who have you worked with children you love? And they look at me a bit quizzically, and then they put their hand up, and then I go down, and who have you worked with children you want to sometimes strangle, and they sort of put their hands up. So naturally we favor certain people over others, but we've got to behave professionally. And what happens is the first thing is that favorite, they blur the line between professional and personal. For example, in language. I mean, I've had instances where coaches are talking to 13-year-old boys in WhatsApps like, how's it my chum, I see your guns are looking good at the gym. It's completely unprofessional, but they pick one or two out of many. The second level is they isolate them. Now, if you think about, for example, a boarding school, and a child goes to a boarding school at 13, they're naturally isolated from their inherent support structures, their previous peers, their parents, the people around them, etc., because they're put in this institution where they're on the lowest rungs. And if you're a bit of a square peg in a round hole, it's quite easy to isolate people within that context. But the next two are the two most important for parents to pick up on. And the first of them is what we call a boundary violation. So a boundary violation is where a professional personal boundary is crossed. For example, you take a single child out to have a meal when you are working with them in a particular area, it's a very small community, or you are WhatsApping a child in the middle of the night, or you're WhatsApping a child about your personal issues. So they cross their personal, professional boundary, and that's where the problems start, because they then create an environment where they almost befriend the children, okay? And they meet the needs that those children have in very real ways, particularly if they've been sent away from home or they sort of slightly out of place. And then the next one is the one I've seen in every single case I've ever dealt with over my 32 years of doing that, and that's what we call a taboo violation. So taboo violations are violations where an adult not only allows a child to do something other adults wouldn't, but actively encourages it, participates in it, and facilitates it. For example, alcohol. Buys the alcohol, provides the alcohol, drinks with the children. I've had instances where swimming coaches have encouraged vaping because it helps you breathe underwater, and you know, those kinds of things. And what that does, that taboo violation, that reinforces the secret, and the secret is the power of the abuse, because what's happened is the child has now crossed a taboo where there's a sense that they've done something wrong, and that's where not the guilt, because guilt is I've done something wrong, the shame kicks in. That is all a testing to see if the child can be abused, and then they cross the boundary into the sexual abuse. And that can be online. We've had people convicted of sexual grooming purely on WhatsApps, without ever touching a child. So there's non-contact, and then there's obviously contact sexual abuse. And then after that, obviously the secret has to be maintained. And while that relationship holds true, you know, that pathological relationship, the secret is retained. The minute that child starts sort of saying, hang on, something's not right, that's where the threats start. And the threats of exclusion, threats of no one will believe you, you know. And in fairness to the children, you know, we say to them, you must say no to adults, but there's not another context on earth where we even allow children to say no to adults. So the fact that they've been told to say no, but they couldn't, leads to this very complex kind of dynamic where there are massive disincentives for them to disclose, and as a result, the secret is kept.
Yeah. And also looking at the secrecy, particularly with the prestigious schools, is that there's always the secret code, there's the bro code, so don't break that, which we're going to get into a bit more. But from you, Dumi, are there any signs of grooming or sexual abuse that parents could identify at the early stages? Because at the end of the day, it's about prevention and creating awareness.
Maybe just to add on what Luke has said, is that it really is about building that relationship with the child, because they will identify a need. It could be an emotional need, and in these situations we realize that maybe a young person wants to achieve something, and of course you would want someone who will focus on you, support you, and that is where the perpetrators, they work on that, and they build on that because they know their intentions, which at the end of the day is to exploit and abuse that particular child. So what I feel is very important for parents, really the core of things is having a relationship with your child. Because if it is out of context, how will you know? When as a parent do you know that your child is happy, your child is upset, or something is off? You only know that when you've got that relationship. So I think that is very fundamental and important for us to stress with parents. Of course, as they grow, they change. You may have all the relationship in the world, but today they are just feeling this way or that way. But you are able to realize that, okay, this is happening over time. And when you see that a child has a very specific and particular relationship, as Luke has said, which is very different from all the other learners with a particular adult in their lives, then you do need to pay attention to the exclusion of others, and that isolation should be a concern. I think also as parents, when you realize that maybe if you want to see what the child is doing on social media, they close off and they don't want you to see, or they don't let you in, that should be of concern as well. So it's the things that you notice that are not necessarily the norm and how we do things at home, and that is where you need to family as an adult say, I'm concerned, what is going on here? Can we talk about it? And you are also able to talk about it when you have that context of we talk about things.
Yeah, communications is incredibly key, especially in the social media world. And you touched on, you know, the changes that we go through. So we know our adolescent years are, I hated my adolescent years. So you're dealing with identity crisis, you're dealing with different levels of depression or anxiety. How do you differentiate between a child going through those, or if you think a child is being groomed or sexually abused?
I mean, when I speak to parents and I do parent talks, I ask who's raising a teenager, and then I ask who has woken up with a stranger in their house. And sort of like 90% of the parents raise their hands because there's a level at which teenagers are getting ready to leave you, which is why they're kind of separating, they're joining their peer group. And then there's a level at which you're getting ready to let them go because they're becoming like quite objectionable, you know. So we must understand that the normality of the separation is towards their peers. The separation is not towards other adults. So if someone is paying more attention to your child than you, and your child is paying more attention to a particular adult than to you, that's a problem. Because what they should be doing is they should be separating to join their peers. Because remember that the other task besides identity that you spoke about is belonging. And belonging, you become where you belong. So what you would see reflected is the peer group. You wouldn't see them accessing another adult. So that would be the first thing. In terms of the behavior, you know, to me, the greatest protective feature for any child against anything, whether it's substance abuse, you know, depression, self-harm, whatever, is the parent. Because we need to connect with our children despite their protests. Because, you know, we're coming up to Youth Day, and teenagers protest a lot. And it's a good thing. It's kind of that emotional spark of adolescence. And we have to be the adult in the room and be able to just reflect and say, I have noticed this, and be able to give them a script for having a conversation, even if they don't yet have the words. So we have to learn to listen to children's behavior and to respond to the behavior in an observational way as opposed to a critical way.
Thank you for that. And also the support that's given to children and families. Let's talk about, you know, some of the work that ChildLine does. And it's not just about support for the victims or survivors, but also the family, which is very, very important.
It is very important because when we talk about child protection, child care, it has to begin at home. We know that in South Africa, which I think is probably the same in other countries, but we see it more here. Unfortunately, the abuse of children also happens within families in the context of someone I should trust, someone who's caring for me, but unfortunately, that is where the abuse takes place. That, however, doesn't mean we should not support families, because also our families are very challenged in our context. So it is very important to support parents or caregivers. It is important to give them those skills and those tools that they need to use as they raise their children. Because I think as parents, we are struggling to understand what we should be doing or not doing in terms of raising our children and young people. So family support and us as professionals giving the support to caregivers is critical. But also what we see is it is probably not helpful to do it in isolation. Talking to parents by themselves and talking to children by themselves, it does not necessarily give us the results that we want. Because you have to model as well. If you say communication, what do you mean? So it's important for us to bring caregivers and children together and have those conversations, because we're modeling how it should be done. And when they get home, they are able to continue. But it's also stressing that, you know, we talk to young people and we say, oh, they don't want to talk to us as parents. And they feel they know it all now and they've got their peers, but they are actually crying out to have a relationship with their parents.
100%.
So that is very important, and we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah. And also vice versa, with parents grappling with trying to have the relationship with kids, you know, competing, as I said, with the social media, with what's out there, with the trends and so forth. Let's go back to the school sector. So before parents, if they don't want to take the judicial route, are there specific bodies that can be held accountable to, that can hold the schools accountable should any cases come up?
Okay, so this is a very technical answer. So I'm going to break it down into a couple of sort of specific things. So there's a lot of child-on-child things happening within these contexts as well, which people don't talk about. Now there's There's the age of criminal capacity. So, for example, I deal with lots of cases where it's a school camp and boys do things with boys and they come back and the parents, you know, are very upset, but it's just between the boys. Now, if those children are under 14, there is no criminal capacity, so we deal with that in a restorative justice approach. If the one child, say 10 and the other one's 15, there is a mandatory reporting to the police case and to social development, but we deal with the 15-year-old in terms of the Child Justice Act. But when it's an adult and a child, it's actually quite clear. So we need to remember that the mandatory reporting clauses for sexual assault is any person who has a reasonable belief or suspicion, not has proven a case. Because remember, the reason we report is to get support. And we are not making an accusation, we are requesting an investigation into the circumstances. And that's any person, that includes parents. So if the parents are the first people who have been told that they are legally obliged to report it. I've testified in a case last month, a murder case where the mother knew the child was being abused by the stepdad. She did nothing, he murdered the child, she got 20 years for not reporting it in terms of deliberate neglect. So you must understand that it's a criminal offence to not report it. Okay. The second part is there are professionals who have a legal obligation, and that's under the Children's Act. They're named in the Children's Act under Section 110, and that report is to social development, where the Child Protection Register lives and where the Register of Children in Canalisation live. So it's not if you must report, it's that you will report for an investigation should you have a reasonable belief or suspicion that you can substantiate. Now, people say, I've got no evidence. If a child has told you something, that is evidence. I mean, what other evidence do you have in sexual assault cases? But then to answer the second part of your question, there's two levels at which there are protections for children in school. So, for example, if you're worried about the fact that the boundary is blurring as opposed to the fact that there's already been abuse, so you catch it early where the adult is behaving in unprofessional, unboundaried ways, that, for example, can be an HR thing in terms of the Employment of Educators Act. But what people must understand is you must present them with the charge sheet when you call them in. Because what happens is you call them in for a discussion, they say, I'm resigning, and then the school says, oh, happy days. I don't have any authority anymore, and off they go. And because you haven't done an investigation, which they're not equipped to do, by the way, and shouldn't do it on their own, they then don't report it to the Council for Educators. And as a result, the registering body that determines the professionalism of teachers is not informed. So they've got someone who's still registered with SES, ends up somewhere else. So interestingly, there are 4 layers of protection in place if you use them.
And if you know about them, that's about knowing your rights as well.
I think that's fair as well. I think in fairness to, you know, it's a complicated system. So I think that's a fair comment, you know. But the thing is, ask. You know, if you don't know something, like, I mean, I'm not going to go and sit in a principal's chair and pretend to run a school. I mean, I have no skills in doing that. I mean, people say they can't do my job. I didn't ask them to. I asked them to do their job so that I can do mine. You know, and we must all do what we are good at. That's what the child protection system is, you know. But what happens is they tend to want to run something internally first to come up with whatever, and what they do is they contaminate things all over the place. So they actually cause harm to everybody, frankly.
And we've seen that just doesn't happen in the school system. We've seen it happen in corporate. We've seen it happen at university institutions where they'd rather just get the person out, and it's almost like getting rid of the rotten fruit. But unfortunately, that rotten fruit will then go to another school, or in some cases, another country.
So what's interesting about that is in the amendments to the Sexual Offences Act, they've included a mandate. So adult sexual offences, there's no mandatory reporting clause, but they've actually included a reporting clause for vulnerable persons. And professors and young people in reses or young people that they are lecturing are considered vulnerable under 25, and developmentally in terms of your brain, that makes perfect sense. So there's a recognition, particularly within that kind of tertiary education, like Wilgenhof kind of world, that there is a vulnerability because these things kind of seep up. And there's been a reckoning that now actually is a mandatory reporting clause with vulnerable categories, which includes the categories in the universities and also under a certain age within corporate. So the protections are there. It's about, as you say, educating and then using them.
And not being scared to actually talk about that. Let's look at rehabilitation, but from the perpetrator's side. What is your take on that, Dumi? Is it possible for perpetrators to be rehabilitated?
Well, I think it is important that we look into that. Speaking from our experience as ChildLine and what we've done in the past, we've actually worked with offenders of sexual abuse. We've also worked with young people or children who act out inappropriately in terms of their sexual behavior. Because we have an understanding that sometimes what we see at the end when people or young people are offending, it's because of what they have experienced before. They may have been victims themselves. They may have observed inappropriate behavior and they are acting it out. What we also know is when children are exposed to domestic violence, it has an impact in terms of what they act out. So it is important that we work with offenders. The challenge, though, is in our country, we don't really have a lot of those resources in terms of working with offenders. Including ourselves as an organization, we're no longer doing that piece of work because of the capacity, but also because of a very specialist skill that you require in terms of doing that piece of work. Is it important? Extremely important. What is also important about it, though, and what we found when we're doing that piece of work, is it helps us as practitioners to understand what goes on in the mind of the person who's offending. And that gives us insight in terms of how then do we protect children from exposure to such behaviors. So there are all those dynamics that makes it very difficult, lack of expertise, lack of such programs in our communities that makes it really difficult to access such services. Also, what we know is some people, yes, they may go through an intervention and understand and stop their pattern of behavior. For others, it is something they need to be in a program for life so that they are contained and do not continue exploiting children. It's necessary, but I don't think we are doing a lot of that in terms of what is available out there.
Absolutely. And I brought that up because not all abusers will go and abuse other people. But the reality is that everybody still has to live with that trauma and with that pain. And that is why it's important for the prevention and get in the beginning before that pain actually happens. In terms of the statistics that are out there, and we look at media, and when they talk about gender-based violence, it's always about the girl child and women, and rightfully so. But this is my personal opinion, that those stats are very, very high because a lot of the cases against boys and men haven't been reported. What is your take on that?
That's absolutely true. There are massive disincentives for men to disclose abuse. Firstly, there never historically has been a language for the victimhood of men at all. You know, so the general narrative is as follows. If you are abused as a boy, you are going to become an offender. So you go, there's not even a time when you are a victim, you just go straight to a potential offender. Wrapped up in that is a whole lot of homophobia, which is causing endless chaos. And I want to stress it's not gay people who abuse children, it's pedophiles who abuse children. That is a sexual pathology. Pedophilia is a sexual pathology, or hebephilia is a sexual pathology, not a sexual preference, whereas your sexual preference is who you choose to have sex with as an adult person. So the result is what happens is that boys will live with an enormous amount of shame because there's the sense of, I'm now damaged, cowboys can't cry, men don't express their feelings, If I tell somebody, they're going to think I'm gay. They're going to think I'm not going to tell anybody because they're not going to allow me anywhere near their children because I'm going to abuse their children because of the vampire myth that men who are abused become abusers. So there are massive disincentives. That having been said, the last study that was released out of schools in South Africa, we actually put out a stat that 1 in 3 girls are abused and 1 in 5 boys are abused. And Africa, or what they call Fact Checked Africa, I think Africa Check, who fact checks things, they contacted us and said, but where did you get these stats from? So we went to the report, and interestingly, the stats when children are abused are identical. So there's slightly different kinds of abuse, which, I mean, we can talk about, but the amount of children, boys and girls, exposed to harmful sexual behaviors as children, okay, is equal for boys and girls. What happens is when they become adults, the offenders become more men, but the children, the gender remains equal. Okay, so there's something in that sort of maturation of masculinity that, you know, presents a particular problem around abuse. But as children, they're identical.
Wow.
Slightly different in nature, but numbers the same.
Yeah. So we've moved into a new government, new change is happening in our country. Scary, in some points very, very essential. In your opinion, if we were to have a magic wand and instruct our government to do, what would you want in terms of the Child Act and Child Protection Act, in where our government have been failing us for in terms of our children?
I think, as we always say, we've got very good legislation. We've got it. But it is about implementing it. That it just still fails us as a country. So we have to look at the child protection system, the pieces of the puzzle that have to come together in order to protect children. What is failing us is those pieces coming together very well. And they are just not coming together very well to protect children. And we're talking about both boys and girls. So we have a system, and we are clear in our minds. We know there's a child protection system. We know there's a referral loop that has to be completed in order to ensure that particular child is safe and protected. So if we, as ChildLine, for example, we have a helpline, and we believe in most instances, we are the first point of contact for children and families with the child protection system. Because if a child is out there in the rural area and they encounter something at 10 p.m. at night, social welfare services are not open at that time, but they can call ChildLine and say, I'm in this crisis. So if we receive that and we report it to a social welfare organization or a child welfare organization, and if nothing is done to then reach out to that child, we've already broken that loop. Or if something is done, but it's not followed through, or we don't get feedback and make sure the child is safe, we've already broken that loop. So our challenge, as we see it, and I really wish it could be fixed, is that we have a system that is responsive. We cannot be everywhere all the time, but if you get a call or you get a referral, respond. Police, they need to deal with cases as they come and respectfully. The courts, they must not make our children wait for 2 years before matters go to court. So if we've got that loop and a proper implementation on what we've got already, I think we are halfway there.
Absolutely.
Can I add to that, please? Because I think it's a critical point. We live in a human rights-based culture, and child rights are paramount. Okay, I think the rights of children have actually been regressive over the last couple of years. I think we have lost rights. So I'll give you a few examples. So sort of as the head of advocacy for women and men against child abuse, I get referred things when things have gone wrong. So I don't get things like at the outset. So I am acknowledging I'm a particular lens. And so in other words, I'm when the system fails, I get called in. So we have got 2 cases at the moment, where the one case is a young girl who was allegedly abused by a carer at school, and she was about 6 or 7 at the time, and he was acquitted because of system bungling. He had abused a whole lot of other children as well. And while that child was being assessed by the police forensic social worker for that case, allegedly that police forensic social worker abused the child. So she's back in court for another case now, allegedly abused by the person who assessed her. She's now 14. She's been in court half of her life, literally half of her life in these cases. Okay, she's writing exams. They tell her, they subpoena her to court. There's no intermediary. The cleaner's got the key for the intermediary room. The camera's not working. I've got another case where a boy is very badly physically and sexually abused by a transporter in Alex. So that other case is in Soweto, in Alex. He's also been in court half of his life because the camera's not working. Every time he goes to court, the camera's not working. So when the president says in his 5-point GBV plan that we have a victim-centric service, there is nothing in the system that is victim-centric, not one thing. Okay. In fact, it's the opposite. So in our attempt through all these, and I completely agree, we have the best constitutions, the best laws, the best systems, the best of everything. But what has happened, if you think of this, we put in place a system where children, we know children are not in a position to give evidence in court. So we create a system called intermediaries, which we fight for. I fought for it. I mean, I've been doing this for 32 years. I've been doing this since '92. We fight for it. We get the separate room. Now we're going to get a camera. Now we're going to train in the intermediaries, which I've also done. I've been an intermediary. Now the children's going to be protected from that system. Now the camera doesn't work. The child's right to a trial is interfered with by camera. We ask, can we assist? And they will say, no, you can't, because it's a perverse incentive, and you're going to then want you're going to want to influence the outcome of the case by your donation of a camera. I'm like, what kind of world do we live in that because of a camera, a child is taken out of her exams, repeatedly traumatized by the system, with no consideration for her life whatsoever. Okay, so this idea that we have a victim-friendly service that protects the rights of children, some of the protections they put in place are actually undermining the rights of children in this country because they can't fix a camera or find a key. What level of dignity are you giving children when that's how you treat them?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that frank answer. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for now, but for our viewers and for those people out there that want to know a little bit more, ChildLine have wonderful social media presence as well as Luke. The number is now 116?
The number is 116 and it's available 24/7 and it is free of charge. So it costs you nothing and we really impress on our communities to use it.
And more importantly is that as we go through these processes, we still have a lot to unlearn. So forgive yourself as you go along the process. But more importantly, become equipped. Create awareness. If you know it's happening, if you've got a gut feeling it's happening, follow up on it. If you don't know, we have the experts here.
But I just want to add to that, it's not just about unlearning. You must be willing to learn.
Absolutely.
Because what happens is people have a way of doing things and this is the way we do it and that's it. And they create a disincentive for people to disclose and report. But, oh, the system's so terrible. We can't report it. It's going to traumatize your child. No, 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 no. Use the system, but then use us, like Women and Men Against Child Abuse, ChildLine, to create that system where these victims are cared for and equip it.
And in order to break that chain, we've got to really ruffle the feathers.
100%.
And we have the experts who are willing to take that fight with you. Luke and Dumi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rosie.